Good evening. Today is Thursday, August 1st, 2019. I now call this Fairfield City Schools Board of Education work session to order. Mrs. Lane, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Begley?
Here.
Mr. Birding?
Present.
Mrs. Gundrum?
Here.
Mrs. O'Neill?
Here.
Mrs. Shorter?
Here.
Mrs. O'Neill, will you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance
Thank you, Mrs. O'Neill. First item on the agenda is superintendent recommendations and reports. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Birding. At this time, I'd like to ask Mr. Martin to cover the items listed under Personnel Professional.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Birding and members of the board, we have several items for your consideration this evening under Personnel Professional. Item number 1, extracurricular resignation for the 2019-2020 school year, letter A. Item number 2, employment, letters A and B. Letter C are extracurriculars for the upcoming school year. Letter D is a reading tutor, and this is out of Title I funds for one of our non-publics, St. Anne's, for the 1920 school year. Letter E is home instructors. That concludes the items I have for your consideration this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. At this time, I'll entertain a motion to accept the recommendations.
So moved.
Second.
Any questions or comments? Mrs. Lane, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Begley?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Neill?
Yes.
Mrs. Shorter?
Yes.
Mr. Birding?
Yes.
Mrs. Gundrum?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Mr. Birding, members of the board, I have several items for your consideration this evening under Personnel Support. Number 1, resignations, letters A through D. Number 2, unpaid leaves of absence, letter A. And number 3, employment, letters A and B. And that concludes the items I have for your consideration this evening under Personnel Support.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. This time, I'll entertain a motion to accept the recommendations.
So moved. Second.
I heard Mrs. Gundrum and Mrs. Shorter as a second. Any questions or comments? Mrs. Lane, will you call the roll, please?
Mrs. Gundrum?
Yes.
Mrs. Shorter?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Neill?
Yes.
Mr. Begley?
Yes.
Mr. Birding?
Yes. Motion passes.